I can remember back in the 1980s when most of you were in high school, the fear and concern was Japan Inc. And there was tremendous tension. Almost think about the relationship with China today from an economic standpoint between the United States and Japan. And that sort of set the table for when the Clinton administration came in and Mickey Kantor became trade representative for the president and then ultimately commerce secretary. And Mickey, you, I think that was a turning point of sorts, and you established a pretty extraordinary relationship with the man who was your counterpart in Japan and ultimately became the Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Hashimoto. Why don't you give your sense about that and talk a little bit about the evolution of the relationship over these years?
Thank you, John, very much. But I would have to say, first of all, Ms. Kaifu, where are you? Were you still? Thank you very much for having us. You've done a fabulous job here with Japan House. I happen to be on the board here, and I'm proud to be on the board, and you have been just terrific. So thank you for what you have done. And Consul General, welcome to Los Angeles. Stay out of the traffic if you can. But with John and Wendy, it's very difficult for me to sit here and share a stage for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which we're friends and good friends. We've done a lot of things together. And I can't imagine, for instance, a trade issue I was involved in that Wendy wasn't involved in. Or another issue, political otherwise, that I was with John, not involved with John. So this is a delight for me, truly a delight. And to see Tom McLean here, of course. Tom, good to see you. Let me start by saying there has been an evolution, John. You're absolutely correct. And it's evolved in the political as well and economic and strategic areas over the last 30, 40 years. In the 80s, it was not good. The U.S.-Japan relationship was difficult, especially in the economics, not strategic, but in economics and political. But beginning in the early 90s and through the 90s and 2000s, it has become better and better. And I can't imagine now a stronger relationship on the face of the earth in the U.S. and Japan between any two countries, because we share the same interests, the same concerns, and the same problems. And many of those problems come out of China, come out of Beijing, but many others come out of just our economic, let's say, economic issues that we face together. And now if you look at Asia, if you look at economic relationships, there are regional agreements all through Asia which didn't exist 30 years ago. And they have really made the life better. We have a rule of law and trade we didn't have before. We even have most countries adhering to them, not all. They're important in many ways. The new IPEF, the Quad on the strategic side, John mentioned the meeting at Camp David, which really has made a terrific difference. These things move our engagement together in a way that we begin to cooperate not only in economic or in strategic, but in both. And they overlap with each other, and they are entwined. And you cannot separate one from the other. Consul General and I were talking earlier. They are so important to each other, the economic and strategic issues. So I hope we talk about that, John, a little bit. These regional agreements, so I'm happy. Well, I'm not happy. I guess I'm satisfied I'm not USTR today, because it is so complicated because of these regional agreements, and they so overlap that it makes it difficult to move issues forward.
Thank you very much, Mickey. And Mr. Consul General, again, welcome to you and your wife to Los Angeles. I guess you've been here for a year, so you are used to the traffic by now. But you're in a neighborhood that's not too far from this spot as well. So I'm sure you're a very frequent guest and participant here at Japan House. But you had a pretty exciting year. Japan had an exciting year with the hosting of the G7. Why don't you talk a little bit about that and the communique that came out of that, particularly as it relates to the importance of economic resilience and economic security.
Thank you, John and Wendy and Mickey. Thank you for joining. Well, thank you for allowing me to join you. It's such a distinguished member of the panel. It's kind of funny to be here. Normally, after Kaif-san's statement, I usually make some remarks for starting the event. But today, I'm a part of the participants of this panel, so I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. And well, I've been joined the foreign ministry in 1989. At the time, we still have a lot of difficult issues between Japan and the United States in the trade issues. I was involved in the trade, especially when the U.S. imposed the Super 301 sanctions against Japan, and that was a really tough time dealing with those issues. And then we have the structural impediment initiative. There have been discussions. So it's a difficult time, but eventually, as Mickey mentioned, that our economic relation is stronger and stronger, and our current economic relation between Japan and the United States is really flourished, and we have so much common, and we've been really working together. And this year, Japan hosted the G7 summit again. And we had in the one time before in Iseshima, but this time we host the G7 summit at Hiroshima, where they are Prime Minister's hometown, and this is an important place to discuss the nuclear disarmament, and also we invited the President of Ukraine. So those political issues is a very important aspect. But of course, at the G7 is starting with discussing the economic issues, global economic issues, and dealing with these 7 countries. One times 8, but now it's 7, back to 7. Of course, the economic issues is always a key aspect that the G7 countries discussing. So normally we discuss the global economy and like the food security or the energy issues, the climate change. This time it's a little different because we are a little bit more focusing on the economic security issues. I remember that the last year in G7 summit in Elmau and in Germany, we also discussed a little bit about this economic security issues. But this time it's unique because we have a separate independent statement about economic security in addition to the normal communique. In this document, we talk about resilient supply chains, and then we have been also dealing with the economic coercions and dealing with the difficult traditional economic practices by certain countries, and also we've been discussing the critical minerals and semiconductors and new technologies we have been dealing with. So that although those are related to the economic issues, it's all connected with, in a sense, security. So I think this is a kind of the new phenomenon we have to deal with, not only talking about economic issues, but the economy is always connected with, in a sense, of securities. We've been, when I was posted in India, we have some discussion how to deal with the 5G issues, who will be providing those infrastructures, and also we also talk about some submarine cable issues with India. Those are mainly how to deal with the economy, but it's also related to security. And even during the COVID, we normally think about some products coming from various countries, like the masks or the equipment, but this is sometimes become very much security strategic products. So those are the issues we have to tackle, and this time G7 countries working together to make the statement about to working together to dealing with economic security issues. That is a key aspect of the G7 summit this year.
Oh, terrific, and a very important aspect. Wendy, just picking up on that, you've been, as Mickey was saying, involved in every major trade negotiation of the last 3 decades. And Wendy started when she was 10, but I'd be curious your thoughts. I mean, both number one on the evolution of the U.S.-Japan relationship, but specifically on this issue, has this been something that has always been, has sort of national security implications of economic relationships always been front and center in the trade negotiations, or is this something that's increased in the last, say 10 years or so?
Well, first, let me just say it's my pleasure and honor to be here at the Japan House. This is my first visit here, and I'm thrilled to be with my friend Sone-san, who our careers have crossed through the many years. And of course, Mickey Kantor. I work for 9 U.S. trade representatives. When I'm asked who my favorite one was, guess what I say?
Charlene Barshevsky.
Who's ever on the stage with me? And John, we don't know each other, but I think through 4 degrees of separation, we know a lot of people who know each other. So it's really my pleasure to be here. You know, when I think of the U.S.-Japan relationship, it's really one that is transformed from one of confrontation to cooperation. And it wasn't an easy path to get there. Japan changed, the U.S. changed, the issues we work on changed, and our common interests changed, and importantly, the region changed, the Indo-Pacific region changed dramatically. For me, when I look at what, when people ask me, well, what was the turning point? And for me, I think it was when Japan looked around and decided that it needed to participate in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. And before then, Japan had been reluctant to enter into these free trade agreements. Why? Largely because of agriculture. It was a very protected market, and they knew that when they went to the table, other countries would ask them to open up that market, and they weren't prepared to do it. Very sensitive sector. But things started changing, and I think Prime Minister Abe deserves a lot of credit for taking the bold step of saying Japan needs to participate in the TPP negotiations. Now, not only did they participate, but then when we left, they kind of held it together and got the other 10 countries to conclude the negotiation and the agreement without the United States. And now it's been in effect for a number of years, with the UK being the most recent entrant to the negotiation. So, I mean, extremely important, and I think a real turning point. When I think of, the issues we worked on in those days, it was automobiles, semiconductors, insurance, you name the sector, we had a problem with Japan, remember? And we'd both come to the negotiating table. Japan didn't want to be there. We didn't particularly want to be there, but the negotiations were pretty acrimonious. But during the TPP negotiations, Japan wanted to be at that table, and they really stepped up to the plate and worked closely with the United States to bring the agreement to fruition. And then just briefly, let me just mention, respond to the question you asked about the economic security issues. These issues now have really surpassed and kind of overshadowed traditional trade issues. National security issues were always there in the trade field. The WTO has an exception for national security, and countries once in a while took the exception to put in some restrictions. But now we're in a world where the economic security issues and the national security issues really overlap and are really kind of defining the economic agendas, not only of individual countries, but of groupings of countries that are coming together to work on these issues. And as Sone-san mentioned, they include resilient supply chains, dealing with advanced technology, and economic coercion and issues along those lines.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and I think that'll be good grist for the mill when we move to our Q&A later in the evening. So thank you so much. I want to stay with you, Wendy, for a minute. You obviously mentioned TPP, and I mean, honestly, I think one of the big misses for the United States when you think about economic security, when you think about national security, was of course pulling out of TPP, and a secondary miss was not being able to complete the TTIP. And having been on the front lines of that one in Europe when we were negotiating it, agriculture was a pretty big issue there too. So I'm still looking for feta Greece, by the way, because there doesn't seem to be one, yet that became a geographic indicator. And so I just wanted to ask you, just from your perspective, the state of global trade negotiations. I mean, what has to happen? I'm going to go to Mickey on this after you speak, Wendy. What do you see happening in our country in terms of, is there a change of appetite potentially that could get us back into TPP or the CPTPP brewing? I for one, am pessimistic. I remember at the G7 at Almau back in 2015, President Obama brought half a dozen Democratic legislators he was hoping to get to vote for Trade Promotion Authority, which not only allows a president to negotiate a trade agreement, but more importantly allows it to get through Congress. And we only had 3 dozen Democrats who supported that. When Mickey got NAFTA done, it was more like, 109 or something. 104. So you see the Democratic Party's been doing that. And now we have President Trump, who his campaign has just said he wants to start out by imposing a 10% tariff on everything, and he's the guy that killed TPP. So give us some hope here. What are your thoughts on that, Wendy, and then Mickey?
Okay, so when you look at polling on trade, it is encouraging. I mean, now, of course, a lot of polling depends on the specific questions you ask. And if you ask, are you in favor of trade because it opens economic opportunities, it's hard to say I'm against it. But if the question's phrased, if a trade agreement means you're going to lose your job, would you support it? So, we need to read these polls carefully. But what's confusing me, and maybe Mickey can help me sort this out, is that in the polling now, the Democrats are much more pro-free trade than the Republicans, and that's probably is the Trump effect.
We're also pro-NATO, too, and all,
But that said, the Biden administration's views on trade and trade agreements is that these traditional trade agreements that people like me and people on the stage worked on during their careers are no longer of interest to the administration. And so they're pursuing broader economic agreements which bring in some of these economic security issues. But importantly, and of great concern to our partners, including Japan, do not include market access. So we're no longer interested in opening markets, which was always the mission, the theme of my career, working for many different USTRs and working for both parties. The hope is, I think that there is a growing recognition that by being on the sidelines, we're losing out now, and other countries are writing the rules. China now has asked to join the CPTPP. It is also in the process of negotiating entering a regional digital agreement, and is also updating its free trade agreement with the 10 ASEAN countries. So China's been very active in the region. Other countries are not waiting for us. They're concluding agreements among themselves, and we're on the outside. And so my sense is that there is a growing recognition that we need to get in this game, even with our domestic political constraints. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is the administration's kind of answer to that stepped-up engagement, and that agreement is expected to be largely completed by this November. But it really doesn't go far enough. And so the question is, can we get back and negotiate these trade agreements again? My view is, and I am an optimist, that if we can reshape these agreements to really address our interests, our concerns, and get our trading partners on board, that, there are opportunities. And just to put a plug in, and I'm going to stop here, for an Asia Society paper that just 6 months ago or so, I authored a paper with a former USTR colleague, a Republican, and we made the argument we should rejoin CPTPP, but we put forward 12 areas where we should seek renegotiation. And based on our just informal discussions in writing this paper with our Japanese colleagues, for example, not that they were going to agree to everything, but I think that they were pretty welcoming of this, because there's a real desire by Japan, by Korea, by certain ASEAN countries, and others, for the United States to get back economically engaged and playing a leadership role in the Indo-Pacific region.
Mickey, what's your take on this? I assume between now and Election Day, we're not going to see a lot of talk about big trade initiatives, but what's your take of where we could be perhaps post the election in 2021?
No, I think that's correct, John. We're not going to see big political movement between now and November of next year. It's just not going to happen. But I see a change in the American public, even with Wendy's a little bit cynicism about polls. The fact is, the polls are fairly clear. The American public supports trade and rules of law in trade. And so therefore, there's room to get things done if we want to provide the leadership. The problem we have here is not the U.S. not just being involved. There's no U.S. leadership at all. Those trade agreements in the past were all U.S. leadership along, and lately, in the last number of years, Japan leadership. You have got to have both involved in order to, and the CPTPP, let me say this without fear of being assassinated here. The fact is that U.S. ought to rejoin it. We ought to have China join CPTPP as well. It does no harm to engage other nations in serious talks in order to try to move the ball forward. We have a problem. We all have a problem with China on economic issues as well as strategic issues, of course, but they're not going to be resolved by not talking. They're not going to be resolved by throwing bricks at each other from Beijing to Washington, et cetera. But that won't happen unless the U.S. takes some leadership, and we've not done so. I don't think it's, but I'll say again, it's not going to happen between now and November of next year.
Do you, we were chatting earlier, and you thought, I think we know where we're headed on this if there's a Trump presidency, or and I think it's very likely that Donald Trump does get the nomination under all the circumstances we're looking at, but even somebody other than Donald Trump, with the possible exception of Nikki Haley or even Mike Pence, I mean, they're all sort of taking that, tough on trade route. But you were mentioning you thought if there were a second Biden term that there might be a different approach. I'm curious about that.
I am at least confident, this is me, and no one else probably will support me on this, a second Biden term would be quite different on trade. There'd be leadership in trade issues. They'd be trying to go back into CPTPP, have an enforcement provision in it. You can't, let me just say this. I always want to say this publicly. You can't have an effective trade agreement without enforcement provisions. It doesn't work, fans. You can talk as all you want, but if you can't enforce what you believe, you can't get things done. That's what worries me so much about the WTO and what's happened there, and their enforcement mechanism basically falling apart because of the United States. We were the ones who walked away from that in the Bush administration. So things need to be done. It's going to be difficult, but we're globalized whether some people like it or not, and not going to change. The only question is, do you want rules or not? Who's going to write the rules? Do you want China to write the rules as they're doing now with the ASEAN countries? Do you want the U.S. and Japan to write the rules? If you want that to happen, you've got to become active and provide leadership.
Thank you. Mr. Consul General Kenko, we've now heard several people mention China, and I'd be really curious, I think everybody would be curious, just what is Japan's view on China right now, particularly as it relates to the economic piece? I mean, I know you're not into decoupling, I hear de-risking. Is de-risking simply another word for decoupling, or is there sort of a new form of engagement that the Japanese government is pursuing as it relates to China?
Well, speaking of China, I mean, it's in the past when we have some statement in the G7 or some various meetings, we try to avoid mentioning China. But talking China, but this time it's thinking changing. I think Japan is more vocally talking about China, including in G7 summit. We have in the G7 communique specifically talking about the China in the paragraph 51, I think. It's the that is in a sense captures the Japanese point of view how to deal with China. The basic policy is to have the constructive and stable relation with China. That is the key message we're always trying to provide to China. We are always urging China to be a responsible country to dealing with global issues so that we are ready to engage with China and the various, well, especially in there's areas of we have common interests like the global climate change issues or the biodiversities and others, energy issues maybe. But at the same time, and we don't decouple with China. We are try to engage, but we also have to be mindful. We cannot really depend on certain countries solely in certain areas, like in supply chains. If you depend on one country, if that supply has been stopped, then everything is stopped. So it's so dangerous. So that the de-risking and diversification, especially in the supply chain, is a key issue that we have been talking about. We have a very strong trade relation with China. I think that China is maybe one of the largest trade partners with the United States as well. There are so many products that's going on between Japan and the United States or Japan, China, so that we cannot really decouple anyway. But we also be mindful what sort of areas we have to be working with China and how to deal with the current situation in China. I have to talk a little bit about the current situation in Japan. We recently discharging the water treated by the process called ALPS, Advanced Liquefied Processing System. To reducing the nuclear products from the water to discharging. This is approved by the IAEA, but somehow Chinese challenging this discharge of the water. They've been currently suspending the whole, the seafood from Japan. And so now we have been challenging these issues, bringing to our regional trade agreement, Regional Comprehensive Economic Agreement, RCEP. We are requesting China to have the consultations. So I think that Mickey mentioned about the implementation really important, so that we have the agreement with China on under the RCEP, how the China has been working on these issues and how they can reacting to implement those issues. And I think that will be kind of the test case for how we can really deal with China. But I also have to a little bit go back to the discussion you have. When I was in Washington in 2011 and 13, dealing with the economic issues, working with Wendy, and Japan joined the TPP negotiations. And before that, I was dealing with Japan-EU relations to try to start negotiation with Japan and EU. And we successfully finished our negotiation in the European Union and with the TPP, although US left. But still, we have been promoting those free trade agreement, including those market access. And we believe that this trade agreement really beneficial for the countries. But Japan is tend to protect Japanese agricultural product, but the Prime Minister Abe really be making big steps to competing with the global market, and in some sense, Japan is really winning those games, and we have been starting exporting Japanese agricultural products, not just importing the products. So that I think, and I hope that the U.S. can learn a little bit from Japanese experience of the, promoting free trade. Thank you.
Oh, that sounds good. I'm sure we have a lot we can learn from that. By the way, on the discharge of the water, I noticed that our ambassador, Mickey, and my former colleague, Rahm Emanuel, made a point of going to a fish market that I had fish actually from that area and eating some sushi, which I think is, as a former ambassador, I go, that was a good move. But anyway, let me just stick with you for a minute. Kenko, I'd love to get your insights on the recent meeting at Camp David with the, obviously the leaders of, United States, Japan, and Korea. And unfortunately, and maybe it's not unfortunate, but I mean, it just seemed that was always, that so much of the press and the reporting on that was viewed from the lens of what does this mean about China, and as opposed to just the importance of that relationship historically or that movement historically and all. Could you comment a little bit about your perspective of how important this meeting was and what might come from it?
Well, I think that the Trilateral Summit meeting was really an important step forward for our collaboration among those three countries. Well, somehow, especially in the previous administration of the Republic of Korea, we have very difficult time, especially dealing with the historical issues. But I think the current President Yoon is very much courageous enough to take actions to move forward to improving our bilateral relations, and that part is also supported by the U.S. government, so that this Trilateral Summit meeting. We have been having several Trilateral Summit meetings in various occasions at the time of the various international fora, like Apec or the ASEAN-related meetings and things. But this is very first time for three leaders get together, especially in the Camp David. It's a special place for the U.S. president hosting the foreign leaders. I think this message is strong. We start collaborating various global issues. Those three countries normally talking about North Korean issues, but of course we have been talking North Korean issues, but we have been broadening our perspective about how the three countries working together in global issues. And that also including the economic security part, so that we start having some early warning tests for dealing with the supply chain issues. So those are the process we have been really working forward for further improving our relations between three countries. And I also have really good relation with the Consul General of Korea here, and we are looking forward to further collaborations as well.
Terrific. Well, I think that's all very encouraging. All right, I want to get to one more topic before we go to Q&A, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions in the audience and folks who have interest in engaging with this esteemed panel, and that is Apec. So we have the Apec conference coming up. The United States is the host. I guess for all three of you, and Mickey, we'll just start with you and come down the line here. I'd love to get your sense of what are the opportunities and what would you hope would come out of this Apec conference? And since this is sort of the Apec year and we're moving into it, are we already missing some opportunities, or the things that you think we ought to be focused on? You and I, Mickey, were on a panel, I think, back in May on this very topic in Pasadena with a lot of the folks that'll be part of APEC at that point in time. So let me just start with you, and maybe give a little bit of, since you were involved in these APEC conferences when you were both Trade Rep and Commerce Secretary, just a sense of sort of the importance of what happens in the conference, and maybe more importantly, what happens in the meetings on the margin of the conference and how that all works.
I was going to start with that, John. The second part is the most important. When I was USTR, President Clinton went to Seattle and met with all the leaders of Apec the first time they'd all come together, the leaders of each of the countries. And it really made a difference. There was some social gatherings. There was a lot of fun and loose talk. And the fact is that it did make a difference. Personal relationships and negotiations are important. And I don't mean to dismiss a situation where you don't have a personal relationship. It is very helpful if you do. Because I remember at one point in a negotiation with Japan, Prime Minister, then not Trade Minister, he was Trade Minister Hashimoto, went to bed, thought we had finished. And I decided to stay in the office. Something told me to stay in the office. It was about 1 in the morning, and my staff came back in and said, the Japanese have rejected the agreement. I said, they've done what? And so I called Hashimoto, and his staff wouldn't let me through, would not let me talk to him. And finally, I insisted. He came on the phone. He got out of bed, got dressed, came 3 blocks away, came up, called his staff into my office and said, now, this is what we agreed to, and this is what you're going to negotiate right now. And we stayed all night. But that was that was a personal relationship, but it also was someone who understood what the interest of Japan was and the interest of the United States.
That's a great story, a terrific story.
It's been true.
Yeah. Wendy, you're...
I'm having a flashback. I think I might have been the person who had to come in and tell Mickey that...
Oh, that's a riot.
Working. He didn't take it very well.
Oh, Mickey not taking something like that well? I can't imagine that.
All this negotiating trick in the book is that, the ministers would agree on something and they'd say their staffs, okay, you go in the other room and hash out the details. And then, I did the same thing, I'll have to admit now, 20 years later, you start unnegotiating what was agreed upon. So many times when it happened against me, then I'd be, we're done. I'm going to go talk to my minister. You talk to yours. Let them finish this out. So
that's great.
Yeah. So yes, APEC APEC now has been around for over 20 years. Frankly, it is losing some of its juice. Part of it is when the initial leaders meeting took place on Blake Island in Washington State. At that time, I don't think leaders in the region got together. And now, what? Yeah, and now there's so many different groupings where leaders get together, and what we're seeing is almost like summit fatigue. And, some of the headlines, in at least our part of the world, are who's not attending which summit. So President Biden, although he'll be attending the G20 summit this coming weekend in India, he's not attending the ASEAN summit in Indonesia. Instead, Vice President Harris will be attending that. And of course, he will be the host of APEC in San Francisco in November, when we're expecting Xi Jinping to come to San Francisco, although it's not, it's not certain. And frankly, there was a surprise this week when China announced that Xi Jinping would not be attending the G20 summit.
I'm sure Modi was happy to hear that.
Yeah. For the first time. I mean, all G20 summits have been, the Chinese leaders always come to those meetings. So
may I throw just one thing in with that, with Modi and Xi Jinping not showing up? Remember how India looks at now the Quad, which is Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, as somewhat containing them, and therefore that had more of a significance than just, I don't want to go to another summit. I think Xi Jinping was trying to send a message.
I think you said India. I think you meant China looks at the Quad as trying to contain them.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, other people, there has been speculation that maybe Xi Jinping's deciding not to go because he doesn't want to see Biden, or there's speculation that his economic problems at home are so bad.
He doesn't want to get COVID from Biden because Jill Biden apparently tested positive for COVID today.
But in any event, I think in all unfortunately, in these traditional groupings that have been around for a while that include China and Russia, it has been difficult to reach agreements among the countries. And that's what our APEC negotiators are experiencing this year, that traditionally in APEC, you would have a number of deliverables, but during the year, as these outcomes and initiatives have been worked on, they have encountered a lot of resistance from China and Russia in particular. But I think the significance of APEC, I think it's an important event for the United States because, again, I think it just underscores how interconnected we are with the Indo-Pacific region, and I think also stresses the need for us to get involved and to really showcase to the American people how important Asia is to the United States.
And Kenko, you've been wearing many hats in the international economic sphere, and just drawing on all that, what is your sense of the significance of this particular APEC conference and what opportunities we have, what we ought to be doing that maybe we're not?
Well, actually, I've been posted in India 2016 and 19, and then coming back to Japan dealing with APEC for the APEC summit in Malaysia. And that is a sort of the moment that Japan, well, the APEC is moving forward. Sorry, talking about a little bit technical terms, there is a so-called BOGO goal, freedom, open trade and investment, agreed by the year 2020, so that we have to think about what will be the next step for the APEC economies to move forward. So we have some new message at the Malaysian summit, although it was online, and then the New Zealand hosts the next summit online as well. So, and then last year was Thailand, and this year it's really important for the United States to hosting the APEC summit. I think APEC is a forum, maybe a little bit looser. We not really moving forward a whole very concrete agreement. It's more like trying to bring the new ideas and new initiative to bring forward for the membership, including those FTARP that being discussed, and I think APEC will be another opportunity for U.S. to engage in the Asian Pacific and bring the strong message to this region. I think that is really important for the U.S. commitment in this region, Indo-Pacific region.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think we're not quite time to go to questions, but we're going to go to questions. So I just it's hard for me to see, I just have to say, but I'm going to block out this light. I see a hand being waved back there. So please ask the first question. Tell us who you are and, your address, your home address, and your cell phone number, and then ask your question.
Sure. My cell phone number? My name is Gunjan Bagla, and I have a quick comment and a question. So my quick comment is that tomorrow evening, Consul General Sone will be at an event where we'll be talking about the Quad along with the Consul Generals of Australia, India, and Camille Dawson is flying in from Washington, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. So it's a sold-out event already, so I'm not trying to pitch it, but I just want to acknowledge Sone-san's support of that event. I wanted to bring the conversation back to US-Japan trade in particular. Here in Southern California, 40% of US trade goes through our twin ports. Japan is the most important investor here in Southern California. Everywhere you go, you see Japanese companies. And I'd love to hear from Consul General Sone about Japanese companies and what they are doing for Southern California.
I'd like to hear about this event tomorrow night.
Sure.
Where is it going to be?
It's going to be in the lovely town of Cerritos.
Ah, Cerritos.
Many of you might not know.
Cerritos of Toyota. I know that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We are sold out, but for $1,000, maybe I'll let you in.
Oh, gosh, I have plans. Kenko, go ahead.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very much looking forward to tomorrow's discussion as well. I think, as you mentioned, that Japanese business presence in Southern California is huge. A lot of investment, number one investor to the Southern California, and also creating a lot of jobs. And I think in that sense, there are relations, not only the trade, but also the investment. Our relation is really important and robust, and we have to further strengthening that relations. And so I think for the Japanese business point of view, the Southern California will be a kind of gateway for our bilateral trade and investment.
Mickey, anybody else want to respond to that or add to it?
I just want to emphasize what was said. 40% of all the goods that come into the United States come through the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. And of course, Japan's a big part of that, but so is China. The largest shipping company at the ports of Long Beach and LA is Chinese Overseas Shipping Company. So we can't forget there's an ever-present notion that China is also deeply involved in this area of the world as well. But it is critical to Japanese Americans and Japan are critical to this state, have made it the bulwark of economic progress that it's become, and we all are grateful for it.
Wendy, anything you want to add? Or okay, and we have a question right here, sir.
Hi, my name is Matthew Asada. I'm with the Department of State, and it's great to see this event here at Japan House. I wanted to actually ask a question for our panelists. As a former labor leader, I represented all of our American diplomats. We were a unionized workforce. Yesterday was Labor Day. We're in the middle of hot labor summer here in Los Angeles, an unprecedented number of strikes or labor activity. An event here at Japan House about 4 months ago, we had George Takai talking about the importance of collective bargaining. I want to ask the people that were involved in the negotiation of NAFTA and other trade agreements, the role of the union, the role of labor over time and today, and what it means for American and popular support for trade negotiations in the future. So any comments on the role of labor then, where we're seeing it today, and what we can expect to see in the future?
Mickey, why don't you start, and then we'll go to Wendy.
I can't report on it today. I'm not involved in them today, but all I can say is, even though labor was deeply opposed to NAFTA, as you know, and other trade agreements, we had constant meetings with labor leaders and representatives of labor trying to work out issues. People forget that in October 1992, at North Carolina State University, President Clinton, then candidate Clinton, decided he was going to say he's for NAFTA, but it's going to have two things: a labor provision where labor laws had to be enforced in the state and the countries in which we operate or traded with, and also environmental provisions. And that made the difference why we got 104 Democrats to vote for NAFTA, which no one ever thought we'd get. Newt Gingrich, all of you probably remember him. Newt Gingrich said to me, "Mickey, I will not have one Republican vote for NAFTA unless you get at least 100 Democrats." I thought I should just resign at that point. It wasn't going to happen. But it did. Clinton met constantly with labor leaders and with others, but with the labor leaders, trying to work out the details in order to make it compatible or to the labor movement.
Wendy?
Yeah, I mean, throughout my career, the input from labor was always valued and incorporated into our proposals. Now, whether we went far enough, probably not in their eyes. But one thing I saw was with each trade agreement, the labor provisions evolved and strengthened over time. And now, when you look at the Biden administration's worker-centered trade policy, they are now focusing almost exclusively on what labor wants. If you talk to some of our businesses, they'll say they don't have an open door anymore at USTR. But there's a lot of focus not only on improving labor standards abroad to make sure there's a level playing field in trade, but also to understand and address their concerns with respect to unfair imports coming into the United States and displacing workers in the United States. But I will say that one thing, I think that people put too much burden, too much, the expectations for what trade agreements can accomplish and what they can cover sometimes is too expansive. And sometimes I think that some of the labor concerns can be adequately addressed or even more effectively addressed through domestic measures. And trade agreements can help, again, by improving standards abroad and also by protecting certain sectors and restricting certain imports. But in order for it to work, trade agreements need to be accompanied by a real strong domestic package that provides adjustment and training and funds for communities where workers are as well.
Yeah, that's what Japan usually do, especially for the agriculture. When you have difficulty for persuading Japanese agriculture related sectors for dealing with for opening up the market, and we have, of course, we have some sort of the safety net mechanism to support those agriculture products. But I'm kind of I've been working in the trade issues and then served in the Geneva dealing with WTO. I'm still a kind of the free trader. And I think the protection is not always the right decision to make the industry competitive. It's opening up some more competition, really helping, so that even it's the Japanese agriculture market, now we have been exporting some agriculture products. So I hope that that part of the good part of the competition, even in the labor market, is also will be addressed in a trade agreement.
You know, there's another dimension to this, which of course is if you're worried about immigration and pressures on immigration, whether it's in Europe and the United States, as we're in two places in particular where we hear this, you do implement policies that have strong labor standards in other countries and force them to do that, you're more likely to lift up the workers there, and you're less likely to see pressures on economic immigration coming from many of those countries. I think people need to kind of think a little bit bigger picture about this. And as a guy who has one daughter who's on strike right now and another daughter who is moving to the State Department, thank you for your service and the work that you do on that. Okay, other questions? I'm going to go to you. Thank you, and then I'll come back to you. I like to, I'm glad to see some women raising their hands. Thanks.
Hi, I'm a CEO of an AI company, and we do AI for global trade compliances and management. So I was just wondering, what are you guys' opinions or observation of digital trade as we're entering the new, era of digital trade? AI become more and more important. Is it going to be something you would emphasize in the future for trade and negotiations?
Good question.
Yeah, why don't I start? Well, clearly the whole issue of digital trade has become an important component of trade negotiations. And so you'll see in many trade agreements going back 10, 20 years, you'll see specific chapters on digital trade or e-commerce. But now what you're also seeing are kind of standalone agreements on digital trade. I mentioned the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which was concluded between New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile, and Korea just joined it, and and China now is negotiating accession. The United States, up until recently, has been a real advocate for these provisions in these trade agreements, including even during the Trump administration under the new NAFTA, the USMCA, there was a very kind of detailed forward-leaning chapter on digital trade. But now what we're seeing is that certain constituencies are having second thoughts about the traditional provisions that we would put in trade agreements, including the need for free flow of data, no forced localization of data in a country, and also protecting IPR and the source codes. What we're seeing in the United States now is kind of a backlash against some of these digital provisions because there's a view that they benefit big tech and don't, and work against the average consumer, worker, or small and medium-sized business. And so these conflicting opinions now are being sorted out, but it's at a time when the United States is trying to conclude the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations where there is a digital chapter. Our trading partners, including Japan, are very frustrated with us. One of my Japanese colleagues even said to me, "You guys sound more like the ASEAN countries and less like, Japan, Australia, and the advanced countries in Asia." But clearly, look, more and more trade is going on in the digital sphere. It's only going to become more important. We need rules of the road there. We also need rules of the road for AI. And in some of these agreements, you're seeing now, at least they're talking about AI, they're coming up with principles, or they're having consultative mechanisms, but that's going to be an extremely important area going forward in trade agreements. And that's why I mentioned the word before. Trade agreements evolve over time. When I look at the agreements we negotiated in the early 90s, they're very different than the ones that were negotiated even 5 years ago. There are new issues that are brought to the table. You look at the environmental and sustainability issues are extremely important in trade agreements. The whole issue of supply chains is becoming more and more front and center in these agreements. But clearly AI and digital and all these advanced technologies are just going to revolutionize how trade is being done, how trade negotiations are conducted. And I think it's in everyone's interest to kind of work together and come up with some principles to promote the good things about AI, but also to prevent the bad things.
Mickey or Kenko, you got anything you want to add?
I'd like to add one thing. If I could walk out of here, it's interesting to hear Wendy and Consul General again. We should be for a rule of law in trade. That is a framework which surrounds everything. What we need is you need regulations that are enforceable and will be enforced in order to have fairness and openness. You cannot have truly open and free trade without law, without rules. And that's where people make a mistake in terms of articulating where they are, I think, in trade. So for me, the one thing I will always walk out of these meetings is I want a rule of law on trade. I want regulations. I want them enforced. And I want everybody to play by the same rules, on a level playing field.
Consul General?
Well, the digital is really a very important aspect that, by the way, well, Japan and U.S. have the digital trade agreement. I don't know, maybe it's already outdated, I don't know. But still, it's at the time when I was the process for approving in the Diet in Japan, it's just
Our
still.
industry would say it's probably the most ambitious digital agreement that's been concluded so far.
Yes, yes, but still, that the development of digital sphere is so fast, and maybe the rulemaking will be a little delayed. So we always have to be mindful about how we can really catch up with those technology to evolve. It's in AI, then we also start talking about quantum computing and things, and so much new things going on, so that we have to be always mindful about the new development of what will be the best way to dealing with those new technologies.
While they were talking, I asked ChatGPT to spit out a trade agreement that addresses these issues. Sir.
Hi, I'm Dana Brofman. I'm based in LA. I've been in the life science industry on the business side for many years. on the issue of AI. I think if it's done correctly, we can get to answers on faster cures and save lives and save money, because clinical trials take a really long time. So that's if it's done right with AI. So my question is related to that. There's concern about China attacking Taiwan in the coming years. And you know that Taiwan makes most of the chips in the world. Is there any way that we can become less reliant on Taiwan and chips and try to become less dependent on Taiwan so there's less of a concern there of China attack Taiwan? That's my main question.
Why don't we start with Mickey and we'll work down the row.
We're building a government-supported huge plant in Ohio. Are you aware of that? To build chips, yeah. It's supposed to be. But I think we ought to be more concerned how we deal with China, how we engage with them, how we avoid a China-Taiwan issue. That would close the Straits of Taiwan. It would close off shipping lanes. It would be a disaster for the world. So for me, I look at it at the other side of it. But the U.S. government, the Biden administration, has reacted and has put a large amount of money into this facility in Ohio.
And I think another one they're doing in Arizona as well.
The Taiwan TSMC is building a plant in Arizona, but they're almost completing their plant in Japan, which is moved ahead a lot quicker than the United States, I think.
Well, but still, that factories in Japan, TSMC, is not really advanced one. It's just more normal one that being used mostly for the automobile, I think. But I think we have been also there is one in Arizona, which is my portfolio, and been supporting Japanese companies to be involved in that process. We have, although in the past, Japanese companies like Toshiba has been really cutting edge technologies in semiconductors, but now it's been not that much, but it's still, we have so much suppliers and machine tools for producing the semiconductors. So we have a lot of common interest in providing more investment in the United States, especially for me, it's in Arizona will be my focus now for involving Japanese semiconductor industry.
You know, I can't imagine China would be dumb enough to attack Taiwan, because it would be the end of their economy and our economy.
Yeah, there's not going to be a lot of great semiconductor chips made when the bombs are dropping and an island is being invaded like that. Well, we have, it's about time for us to wrap up, and what I'd like to do is I'll start with you, Mickey. We'll walk right down the aisle here and have you all offer any final thoughts or final words that you'd like to say.
Well, my final is to thank everyone who came and thank Ms. Kaifu as well for being here for this. This is a subject that doesn't draw millions, but it's critically important to the future, not only of the United States, but of Japan.
Wendy?
When I look at these issues that we're dealing with, I can't think of a closer partner than Japan. And if you had told me that 30 years ago when I started working with Japan, I would have told you it will never happen.
Interesting.
But it's amazing how our relationship has strengthened and evolved. And now when we look for that partner who's going to help us in the region or in the world, or you know, to deal with some of these global challenges, Japan is always there. And there is, you know, there's still some friction. I know Japan probably isn't very happy with some of the discriminatory provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act, or it really doesn't understand why we can't just rejoin CPTPP. Or that maybe that, you know, we're a little too enthusiastic about imposing more export controls. But even with all of that, we keep those differences private. We work them through responsibly. And again, you know, looking ahead, I think this relationship is only going to deepen and strengthen.
Terrific.
Good. Well, it's been really enjoying talking with you all, and I think a very important aspect that is that as Mickey mentioned about the personal relations, especially when we have trade negotiations, sometimes really tough, spend whole night. But I think the good part is between Japan and the United States that there is always a trust between us, so that we have trust with Wendy so that we can make a deal and TPP, although US left, but still we are believing, trusting the United States to coming back, as Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister always mentioning about the way Japan is expecting US to coming back to TPP. I think the important part is, of course, as mentioned, that the personal trust or personal relations, so that that is a good part of Japan-US relations. Whenever issues came, we can talk and to engage, and that is a really important aspect of our bilateral relations. That will never change, and we would like to continue that good relations in the personal level as well. I thank you.
Well, thank you so much for those positive words. I will say for myself, I may have been the ambassador to Germany, but I drive a Lexus. And a big round of applause for our esteemed panel here. Thank you very much.